Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. Imagine being given a job you never expected to have. Your boss has just died. You're in charge now. And before you even have time to settle in the chair in the Oval Office, one of the greatest political disagreements of your day is on your desk. That was Millard Fillmore's summer of 1850. The nation, divided by slavery, was threatening to tear itself apart. And suddenly, he had an enormous responsibility: holding the nation together and preventing civil war. Fillmore was eventually able to find compromise, and for a moment, America survived. But as we're about to find out on today's episode, stopping a crisis and solving one are two very different things. This is the story of Millard Fillmore. Let's do this. Millard Fillmore was born 7 days after the turn of the century on January 7th, 1800. In Cayuga County, New York. He grew up into a poor farming family with very little access to formal education. As a teenager, Fillmore was apprenticed into cloth making, but that life wasn't exactly calling his name. Instead, Fillmore became determined to become educated, even if he had to educate himself. Eventually, he studied law. And during his climb, he attended New Hope Academy, where he had a little connection with one of his teachers, whose name was Abigail Powers. They eventually fell in love and got married. Now, before you think of a 30-year-old woman talking to a first grader, Fillmore was 19 years old, and Abigail was only about 2 years older than him. After possibly helping him with his homework, the teacher and student eventually fell in love and married in 1826, beginning a partnership that would remain important throughout Fillmore's entire life. Abigail and Fillmore both loved the idea of education, and together they built a life as Fillmore's legal career began turning political. Fillmore's first political affiliation was with a group called the Anti-Masonic Party, a movement built around suspicion against a group called the Freemasons. The Freemasons were a group that had rituals and organizations and meetings that were mostly about brotherhood and morals. But here's where the problem came in. People began to see the Freemasons as this pretentious group of aristocrats who were trying to control the world, even though we really don't know that. That becomes even more interesting when you consider who was a Freemason, because that group has included some pretty important Americans, including our first and best president, George Washington. Fillmore and this anti-Masonic party weren't declaring war on the Founding Fathers, but they were suspicious of powerful people gathering behind closed doors and potentially giving advantages to their buddies, because that might break the ideas of democracy. Eventually, instead of sticking to the oppression of the Freemasons, Fillmore found a more permanent political home with the Whig Party. And if the word Whig, spelled W-H-I-G, sounds strange, the name itself has a history. The word Whig traces back to opponents of the royal power in Britain. Now, why would royal power have anything to do with the American presidency? The American Whigs adopted the name partly as a jab against President Andrew Jackson, whose enemies portrayed his powerful presidency as something dangerously close to a king. They would even jokingly call him King Andrew. The Whigs weren't against having a president. They believed that Jackson had pushed presidential power too far, and they preferred a government where Congress and other institutions played a stronger role. So we're not putting the decisions of the entire country on one man. Fillmore fit pretty naturally into this new Whig philosophy. He wasn't known as some larger-than-life political celebrity. Fillmore was more of a steady figure in an era that was filled with so many politicians trying to be the next big thing. That made Fillmore different. He served in Congress and eventually became an important New York Whig, which led him to becoming the New York State Comptroller, which, to put it very simply, means he was one of the people responsible for overseeing the state's money, its finances, similar to something like a state treasurer. Fillmore also operated inside the increasingly powerful world of New York politics. New York had lots of ports. The Port of New York was one of the busiest in the entire country. New York politics were foundational for the entire country. All this power, all this responsibility, what would it lead to? The election of 1848. In 1848, the Whigs nominated the Mexican-American war hero Zachary Taylor for president. Was Zachary Taylor this larger-than-life politician like I was talking about earlier? No, he wasn't a politician at all. We've heard a lot in recent politics about people not being a politician. But newsflash, if you're running for a political position, you're pretty much already a politician. Zachary Taylor was a war hero who his only experience was interacting with the people, never serving in a public office. Taylor selected Millard Fillmore to balance the ticket as a Northern Whig representative. Wait, did Zachary Taylor choose Millard Fillmore to be his vice president? I mean, they might have been like best buddies or something. Not exactly. And here's a fact that would be absolutely insane if it happened today. According to many sources, Taylor and Fillmore apparently didn't even meet until after the election. Imagine winning the White House and basically saying, well, I guess I should meet the vice president. He might help me out a little bit. How does that relationship even work? Well, it didn't. Their relationship didn't exactly improve dramatically once they met after they won the election. Fillmore was basically excluded from Taylor's inner circle of colleagues and spent much of his vice presidency doing what vice presidents historically did best: very little. But little did Fillmore know that the presidency was much closer than he could have ever expected. In July of 1850, after attending Independence Day celebrations, Taylor became extremely sick. He had consumed cherries and iced milk and the contaminated water of Washington, D.C. around the time that his illness began. And although historians cannot simply blame the cherries for his death, if you want to learn more about not only his death, but also his presidency, go check out our Season 3 episode number 12, Rough and Ready, Not for Cherries. Fillmore could have never imagined that a bowl of cherries, some iced milk, and some questionably colored water would lead him not only into the presidency, but also one of the greatest political crises of his entire era. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". Franklin Roosevelt was the president for over 4,000 days. These are facts. But you know what else is a fact? The fact that Presidents Unplugged has an Instagram page. If you want presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. That is presidents_unplugged. I'll see you there. When Millard Fillmore became the 13th President of the United States, the country was being ripped apart by the question that politicians had repeatedly tried to contain: slavery. The United States had gained enormous Western territories following the Mexican-American War. And I'm not talking about a couple cities on the West that we conquered. I'm talking about almost doubling the size of the United States. The thing that everyone wanted to know was whether slavery would expand into these new territories. Senator Henry Clay, who was also a member of the Whig Party, attempted to create one enormous package bill addressing several of these disputes together: an omnibus bill. Omnibus is our word of the day. Omnibus means containing several different things at once. In this case, a package deal. Unfortunately for Clay, Congress looked at his massive compromise in the omnibus bill and essentially said, yeah, there's no way we're all going to agree on that. The reason it was so difficult is because the bill didn't just decide one major decision. It was trying to make lots of decisions at once. Different politicians supported different pieces of the bill. Combining all of these elements into one bill made passing it feel impossible. And here's where a young Democratic senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas comes in. Douglas helped separate Clay's omnibus bill into a bunch of individual bills, allowing different groups to vote for different pieces. Together, those measures of separating the big bill became known as the Compromise of 1850. It's easy to get the Compromise of 1850 mixed up with other elements of the pre-Civil War era. They all sound so similar, right? But we have to realize how much the Compromise of 1850 really accomplished. First, California entered the Union as a free state. Next, Texas surrendered certain Western territory in what would later become New Mexico. That leads right into the next piece, where New Mexico and Utah were organized as territories. The question of whether slavery would be allowed in these new territories was left to the idea of popular sovereignty. And just as a recap, popular sovereignty is when the people of the territory vote if slavery should be present or not. A supposed democratic process that often led to chaos. Next, the slave trade, though not slavery itself, was abolished in the capital, Washington, D.C. So there's 4 pieces right there. California being added, Texas surrendering Western Territory, New Mexico and Utah becoming territories, and the slave trade being abolished in D.C. Great. There's not a test at the end of the episode. I promise. I say all of those four to talk about the fifth. This is where the Compromise of 1850 becomes controversial, with the fifth and final piece, the Fugitive Slave Act. This law strengthened federal mechanisms for capturing and returning people who had escaped slavery. This becomes a problem when slaves that had literally escaped to free states could be recaptured, put back into slavery, if one witness testified against them. This became a moral issue. No more changing the map. No more, is this a territory? Are they going to allow slavery or not? This was all becoming a moral decision. And that decision landed directly on Millard Fillmore's desk. Yeah, I almost forgot we were talking about Millard Fillmore for a second. Fillmore signed the measures and supported enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act as a federal law, promoting people to testify against slaves that had escaped. And if you tried to help an escapee because you felt like it was the right thing to do, you would get fined $500. Oh, I guess I could pay $500, which is equal to over $20,000 in today's money. The Northerners were furious. They called Millard Fillmore a common phrase of the day, calling him a doughface, a Northerner who was a little too willing to accommodate for the slaveholding South, also known as he wasn't making strong decisions. He was letting anyone who talked to him mold and shape his views in whatever way they wanted. Fillmore was trying to be the middleman, and he believed that compromise could preserve the Union. And in a sense, it did. But it also didn't, because for a second, the crisis cooled down, but the underlying problem hadn't disappeared. Fillmore had kicked the can of slavery farther down the road for the next guy to deal with. America had bought time, not a solution. Fillmore would spend the remaining 2.5 years of his presidency attempting to maintain stability, keep the country from thinking that we might be close to a civil war, because we're not, guys, I promise. By 1852, Fillmore sought the Whig presidential nomination, but the issue was the Whig Party was beginning to collapse in on itself. They were so divided, they didn't know what to believe on slavery, and eventually they chose General Winfield Scott, maybe to get another general in the White House like they did Taylor, but they ultimately lost to the Democratic candidate Franklin Pierce. Looking at a presidential poster in your U.S. history classroom might make you think that the Whig Party was a dominating force for a good chunk of American history. I mean, the 9th president, William Henry Harrison, was a Whig. The 10th president, John Tyler, was a Whig. We had a Democrat in there with James Polk. Zachary Taylor was a Whig, and Fillmore was a Whig. Oh my goodness, the Whig Party is just a dominant force. But what if I told you that Millard Fillmore, the president that served for less than 3 years, is technically the longest-serving Whig president? You're telling me not one president for the Whig Party ever had a full term? No. William Henry Harrison survived for 30 days. Good job, dude. We had John Tyler, who served out the rest of his time, but was kicked out of the Whig Party halfway through his term. We have Zachary Taylor, who ate some cherries and died only a year into his presidency. All that leaves is Fillmore. They just had some bad luck in the Whig Party and some very confusing ideals, especially when it came to slavery, which prevented them from taking the White House ever again. Fillmore left the presidency in 1853, and tragedy in his life followed almost immediately when Abigail Fillmore became sick after Franklin Pierce's inauguration and died only weeks later. Fillmore eventually traveled abroad, and that's where we get one of my favorite Fillmore stories. Because according to a famous story repeated about one of his trips to England, Queen Victoria supposedly described Fillmore as one of the handsomest men she'd ever seen. Whether Victoria actually said this is obviously difficult to prove, so take that one with a little historical grain of salt, because honestly, she might have just not been wearing her glasses that day. But Millard, I'll give you the win for that one. Fillmore wasn't finished with politics either, even after being called attractive by the Queen of England. In 1856, he ran for president again, and this time as the candidate of the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party. Wow, that sounds confident. I mean, the Know Nothing Party was a movement deeply hostile towards immigration and especially Catholics in politics. Yikes, Millard. Its nickname of being the Know Nothing Party came from the secretive movements that members supposedly answering questions by saying they knew nothing. Fillmore ran in that election and only won the state of Maryland. And that presidential election would be the last he would ever run in. During the Civil War, just after this election, Fillmore supported preserving the Union, similar to what he believed during his presidency, but he became a critic of Abraham Lincoln and aspects of Lincoln's administration. He lived until 1874, dying in Buffalo, New York at, you guessed it, the age of 74. And today, Millard Fillmore is one of those presidents whose name can produce the response that every president fears. Wait, who was that again? Fillmore becomes much more interesting when you look at his presidency in the context of American history at that point. And to end this episode with a fun analogy, I'm going to explain Millard Fillmore's presidency for the United States. Imagine America is a car speeding towards the Grand Canyon. We're going to drive right into the canyon. We're going to die. What are we going to do? Oh, there's Millard Fillmore. He walks in the middle of the road, and he's holding a giant stop sign that's labeled The Compromise of 1850. And the car stops. Everyone catches their breath and cheers. Hooray! We avoided this massive canyon. Fillmore looks around, decides the scary crisis has passed. He lowers the sign, and he waves the car forward. We drive right in the canyon and suffer the consequences. Am I saying that Fillmore caused the Civil War? No. Am I saying that the Compromise of 1850 accomplished nothing? No. it just is difficult to understand the value of the compromise in American history when it never truly solved the problem. It delayed the crisis without resolving the fundamental division and injustice which was driving it in the first place. And that, to me, is the Fillmore presidency. Not a big, major compromise that changed the world forever, but the pause. The pause that led to one of the most cataclysmic periods in American history. And that is why Millard Fillmore is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about the Watergate scandal. Last August, I made an episode about Richard Nixon. The episode was called More Than a Scandal. What scandal am I talking about? When Richard Nixon was directly affiliated with a group of individuals who tried to capture data in a private location by bugging the rooms and listening to the conversations. Big deal. That's a big deal. Would it have become a big deal if Nixon didn't attempt to hide the tapes, keep it private, and lie to the American people? The Watergate scandal is an unbelievable story, and you don't want to miss it. Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.